My name's Eric Hernandez. Like I said, I'm the apologetics lead for the Baptist General Convention of Texas. And what I want to talk with you guys about tonight is whether or not the soul exists, the existence of the soul. And this is a topic that really hits home for me for quite a few reasons. Freshman year of college, I took my first philosophy class. And I remember growing up in youth group, what I really liked about philosophy, as contrast to the youth group I grew up in, was that I was allowed to ask questions. I remember the church that I went to, at least on 2 different occasions, I got in trouble for asking questions by a couple of my youth pastors. And what troubled me about this was that after every service, they would say, invite your friends next week. And I'm thinking, no. Why would I want to invite my non-saved friends when I, as a Christian, cannot ask questions in church? What would be the purpose of that? And I remember one time my youth pastor, he said, if anyone ever asks you to prove to them God exists, you simply have to respond by saying, well, prove to me he doesn't. And I thought, oh, that's brilliant. I'm going to put that in my back pocket, and I can use it whenever I need to. So without going into all the details of the story, freshman year of college, I'm picking my electives, and there was one elective in particular called philosophy. And I thought, in my mind, I thought philosophy was just making stuff up and sharing your opinion, and I'm good at doing both of those, so I thought I can sign up for this class, and I can skip on occasion and just kind of be one of those flyby classes. Well, first week of class, my professor says, this week we're going to talk about something known as the burden of proof. And what the burden of proof is, essentially, is that if you make a claim that something's true, then you now bear the responsibility or the burden to provide evidence or a justification for why you believe the claim that you do is true. And then he said, as a random example, and I later found out he was an atheist, so this wasn't a random example, but he said, as a random example, if you're a Christian here today, and you claim to believe in God, and someone asks you to prove that God exists, you cannot say, prove to me he doesn't, because that would be to inappropriately shift the burden of proof, because if you make the claim, you bear the burden. And I felt like my house of cards just kind of collapsed, but I was intrigued. And again, to reiterate, what I loved about this class is that I was allowed to ask questions. I really learned. He was very even-handed, and I kind of really fell in love with philosophy at this time. Second semester is about to roll around, so I want to take another class in philosophy. And everyone warns me that if you're going to take another class in philosophy, whatever you do not take Professor Pena's class. He's an atheist, he's antagonistic, he's condescending, and he's going to try to make you lose your faith if you take his class. And my thought was, well, where can I sign up? Not because, of course, I wanted to lose my faith, but call me crazy. Growing up, and I was raised to believe, and my parents are here, along with my in-laws here tonight. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for them, literally, because that's how biology works. And I remember thinking to myself, if Christianity is true, I need to know why. Now, at this point, I knew nothing about apologetics or philosophy or anything like that, but I also understood that if Christianity was false, I'd still like to know why, and maybe this guy was the guy for the job. And so the pivotal day in class, in my life, in my ministry, was this. He walks into class one day, and he pretends to hold up this antidepressant pill. And then he begins the lecture by saying, now, religion wants us to believe in something like a soul, which is supposed to be immaterial, and because of the soul, we can have hope in an afterlife and seeing our family and friends that have gone before us. And according to Christianity, this immaterial soul is also what contains your thoughts, your emotions, your sensations, your desires, your beliefs, and these are also supposed to be immaterial. But the problem was, he said, that if I were to take this antidepressant pill, which is physical, then it has the power to affect and change the alleged immaterial states of my immaterial soul. But how could this be? How could something immaterial affect or change the physical? How can something tiny and physical affect the immaterial? Because every time we look at the brain, every time a scientist looks at the brain, all he sees are neurons firing. And every time scientists look at the body under a microscope, all we find are the base elements of things like carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, but no scientist has ever looked under a microscope and found anything even remotely close to something like a soul. And again, how can that be? Well, he said, I'll tell you how. The answer is simple. The answer is that there is no soul, there is no heaven, there is no hell, there is no God, there is no afterlife. You are just a physical meat machine, a brain and body, And we need to learn to live with this fact, get on with our lives, and stop believing in these fanciful, foolish fairy tales. Class dismissed. This is what the Bible calls a stronghold. And particularly, it comes from a worldview known as naturalism. We won't have time to get into a discussion of what strongholds are, but I brought some material with me I'll touch on later, where we go through the three dominant strongholds within our culture. One of these strongholds is known as naturalism. And it is a view that the physical world, material world, is all that exists, nothing more, nothing less. And before we start to get into any arguments or evidence for the soul, let's first unpack where this notion comes from, that everything is reducible or identical to something physical. And again, this comes from a worldview known as naturalism. Now, naturalism can be defined with three isms. There are three isms, if you will, to naturalism. And the three would be empiricism, reductionism, and physicalism. This will be on the test, so write it down. And we can define these in this way. So empiricism is what's called in philosophy and epistemology. It's a view of knowledge, and it's the view that knowledge is attainable or gained only through the senses. So if you want me to believe in something, you may hear someone say, if you want me to believe in God or the soul, I need empirical evidence, something that I can see, touch, taste, or smell, something that's repeatable, something empirical. And this also comes from another worldview, a stronghold known as scientism, which is a view that science alone is the best or only way to gain knowledge about reality. So if you want me to believe in something, I need the scientific evidence. Again, without going into the details of this, this epistemology is not just an appreciation for science, it is quite literally a worldview through which you see the world and think the only way I can gain any knowledge, any truth about reality is through science. And if you cannot detect or identify or study something scientifically, then either it's not true or it simply can't be known. And hence you hear my professor earlier saying every time a scientist looks under a microscope, appealing again to this empiricism perspective, we've never found anything like a soul. And then this also stems from, in addition to this with naturalism, you have this reductionistic mentality, what we can call reductionism. And it is essentially a notion that you can identify by looking for the nothing more than or nothing but kind of language. So he said that we are nothing more than a brain and body. We are nothing but a meat machine. So to give an analogy, if I said that marriage was nothing more than signing a piece of paper for the government, then I have reduced the notion of marriage to nothing but a document. So with this reductionistic approach, everything is explainable by some type of physical, chemical, scientific means. Everything is reducible. So what is love? Well, there is no love. Essentially, love is just a group of chemicals firing in your brain. There is no such thing as love or morality. It's just a bunch of neurons firing based on an evolutionary process that has got us here, that has made us think a certain way based on natural selection. So everything is reduced to something else. You also find this sentiment with prayer. There was an article that came out some years ago, and keep me in your prayers. I'll be coming out with a book next year on witnessing to non-believers, and I quote this article where this guy invented what he called the God helmet. And essentially, what it does is they can now put this helmet on you and stimulate certain regions of your brain to make you feel as if someone's in the room, or make you feel as if you're talking to God, when in reality they say, no, look, it's just a helmet. It's just neurons firing in the brain. It's a reductionistic mentality. And then all of this, you see that everything that exists, as I said, is explained and reduced to simply something physical. And then these kind of go hand in hand, because then we get to now what we're talking about here is physicalism. Now, physicalism is the view that human beings are purely physical objects. In other words, you and I, we're nothing but, again, that reductionistic mentality. Human beings are, when you break it down, you look at the empiricism, the reductionism, it leads to this physicalist notion, and hence human beings are composed of purely physical properties and parts. So we can put it this way. According to the worldview of naturalism, when you apply, if I can use a $5 word, when you apply the naturalist ontological perspective, ontology meaning the study of what exists, when you apply this perspective to human beings, you get what's known as physicalism, which would essentially imply there is no soul. So if naturalism is true, there is no God, there is no soul, just like my professor was saying. Only physical substances exist. Now, who cares? Right? What does it matter? for quite a heavy reason. I remember sitting in class when I heard my professor say this, and what really troubled me was up until that point in his class, I had heard a lot of complaints against Christianity. You know, you might oftentimes hear people say, well, the God of the Bible did this, or the God of the Bible does this, or Christians do this, Christians do that. Well, even if that's the case, that wouldn't prove Christianity is not true, right? If I have a son, well, I do have a son, and he acts like a jerk, it doesn't mean I don't exist, right? So at this point, I had heard a lot of complaints against Christianity, but nothing that would prove Christianity false. However, for the first time in my life, I had heard an argument that if what he was saying is true, then Christianity would be false. How so? Well, let's look at what Paul says. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 14 through 19, Paul is essentially saying this: if there is no resurrection, here's how he puts it. If Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is, and he says it's going to be vain, useless, and it amounts to nothing. And then he goes as far as to say, if you didn't get it the first time, it's vain, imaginary, and unfounded. It's devoid of value, benefit, not based on truth. And then again, in this Greek culture, when you would repeat yourself, because there was no punctuation in the Greek, the way they would add a punctuation of like an exclamation mark, if you will, is they would repeat themselves. Hence, you see Jesus saying, verily, verily, I say to you. That's their way of putting an exclamation mark on the sentence. So he's repeating himself and says, and if Christ has not been raised, and now your faith is worthless, powerless, a mere delusion, we are of all people most miserable and to be pitied. So he's saying, if there is no resurrection, Christianity is false, and people should actually feel sorry for us for how dumb we are, quite frankly. So essentially, if there's no resurrection, then we're wasting our time here. Now, how does that relate to the soul? Well, consider this. Given what Paul's saying, if there is no resurrection, Christianity is false. But by the same token, here's what troubled me, and here's why I say, for the first time, I hear an argument that if true, would prove Christianity false. Because if there is no resurrection, Christianity is false. But note, if there's no soul, then there can be no resurrection in principle. Why? Because the Bible talks about being raised bodily, but you still exist in this intermediate state. And every time you look at resurrection, every time you look at afterlife, every time you look at what's called apocalyptic literature, or them talking about the second coming, here's an example. Paul says, to be absent from the body is to be what? Present with the Lord. Hence, he is insinuating a state of existence, what we call in theology an intermediate state, where you exist to some body. Why? Because at your core, we'll talk about this later, you are a soul that has a body. But essentially, you're a soul, and hence, you can be absent from the body with the Lord, without a body, awaiting a resurrection of the final body. So, if there's no soul, in principle, there can be no resurrection. And once again, if there's no resurrection, Christianity is false. So how would you respond to something like this? Have you ever thought through anything like this? Well, let's start with some definitions. What is a soul? So here's how we're going to define it for tonight. The soul is an immaterial substance that possesses consciousness and animates the body. And we're going to break this down. We're going to take it relatively slow. But what we're going to focus on is these 2 points here. The soul is an immaterial substance, and it is a thing that grounds, owns, and possesses conscious states. And there are really 2 basic points that we're going to pull off from this, but I want to take a second here to just retouch on this notion of the stronghold and this worldview of naturalism. As I mentioned earlier, there are 3 dominant strongholds in our culture. We're not going to go through them, but suffice it to say, all of these strongholds have crept into the church and we haven't realized it. Now you may be thinking, after everything I've just said, how could a worldview or a stronghold such as naturalism, how could that creep in the church? Well, let's do briefly some audience interaction. I want you guys to do me a favor. Can you please point to me? Can you point to what part of your body thinks, please? What part of your body thinks? Okay, I see people doing this. So are you saying brain? Brain? Does your brain think? Okay. So let me ask you this. Okay, so you say it's your brain that thinks. You need a brain to think. Does God have a brain? I didn't hear anything that time. I'm sorry. Is this a Mormon church? It's not a Mormon church, right? It's a Christian church? Okay. Just making sure. The answer is no. God doesn't have a brain. Mormons believe God has a brain. We're not Mormons, right? Mormons believe God is physical, that he was once like us. But Scripture teaches that God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in... It is a Christian church, yeah. So, does God think? Yes. Psalm says his thoughts towards us are more than the grains of sand. He thinks, and he's crazy about you. But wait a minute. You said earlier it's your brain that thinks, and you need a brain to think. But God doesn't have a brain. He thinks. Are you made in his image? Huh. Do you need a brain to think? Now, if you say yes, we're going to have to do that all over again. And I don't. So the short answer is no. And again, we're going to get into this later. But here's my point. Why was this a conundrum? And I don't want you to necessarily feel bad. Every church I've ever gone to and given this presentation, it's always the same answer. But why? Here's the nutshell response. We live in this culture that tries to appear neutral on a lot of fronts. I mean, just turn on the news and you can see, well, they don't always do a good job at that, but essentially this is what happened. The secular culture says, well, look, we know that when you think, there is neurological activity in the brain, so why can't we just say that it's the brain that thinks? And the church says, well, I'll tell you what, let's agree it's the brain that thinks, but as long as we can talk about the soul and spirit in Sunday school, sure, we're fine. So we make this almost unspoken agreement that we'll agree the brain thinks, and then we engage in their language and talk about brains that think, and then we come Sunday morning, we lift our hands and worship a God who has no brain and thinks just fine, but we never let these two beliefs come together because, quite frankly, we don't take our theology that seriously. Stronghold. Because throughout the history of Christianity, there has always been this notion of a soul, that you are a soul with a faculty, a capacity of mind, and these are immaterial things about yourself, and you as a soul has a faculty of mind, and it is your mind that thinks, and you use your body much like an instrument, but you are a soul at its core. And yet you ask your modern Christian today what thinks, and they say, oh, it's your brain, of course. You know, one of my pet peeves is, especially when Christians say this, I had someone say, Eric, can I pick your brain? And I said, why would you want to do that? It's just matter and fluid. I'll let you pick my mind because I think that's what you're looking for. In fact, one time I did this at a secular job I was working at years ago, and the lady was kind of confused, so at my poor attempt of making a philosophical joke, I explained it to her, and she said, well, you know what I mean, same thing. I said, well, not really. And based off this bad attempt to make a joke, within 5 minutes, it became an evangelistic conversation about how we are souls related to God, and God's the ultimate soul that created us. Go figure. So, what is a soul? Again, it's an immaterial substance that possesses consciousness and animates the body. Now, if you want to have a discussion with anyone on the existence of the soul, I say there are only two basic points that you have to make when it comes to this. Their first point is that consciousness is not physical, and the second is that I am more than a brain and body, I am a soul. Now, before we go into that, here's what the kind of pushback I usually get. Because people say, well, if you want to know whether or not the soul exists, what we have to do is turn to science. Because science is what answers everything. So, you want to know if the soul exists, what does science have to say about it? But is this the right tool for the assessment? No. Imagine this. Suppose you get a call from your neighbor, and he calls you up and says, there's an invisible man inside my house. And you, being the skeptical person that you are, say, I don't believe you, but I'll tell you what, I'll come investigate for myself. So you come to his house to investigate. And after a few hours of investigation, you come back, and you're really upset with him, visibly. And you say, I think you're lying. And he says, why would you say I'm lying? And here's your response. Well, you told me that there was an invisible man in my house. And he says, there is. And you said, no, there's not. Because, see, after 2 hours of looking, I never saw him anywhere. I looked in the closet. I looked in the bathroom. I looked under the bed. I even looked in every other room, and I never once saw this invisible man. And, of course, your neighbor, with a frustrated look on his face, pulls out his hair and says, well, of course you didn't see him because he's invisible. Now, to be fair, what he said doesn't prove he's right and there is an invisible man, but it does prove that if you want to argue against the existence of this invisible man, you cannot appeal to your sense of visibility in order to disprove something that is not visibly capable of being seen. You with me? It's the wrong tool for the assessment. So I can put it this way. So science is a wonderful tool. It's a wonderful tool for studying the physical world, but it is a tool that is limited to only studying the physical world. And see, something like the soul, if the soul exists, it is by definition a non-physical entity. So the problem is, it's what we call in philosophy a category fallacy. What's a category fallacy? It's like me asking, how much does a number 2 weigh, what color is it, and how many can you put in your pocket? The questions don't apply to the notion of the number 2. So science can only study the physical. The soul is by definition non-physical, which means you cannot use a discipline like science, which again is limited to the physical, to try and investigate something non-physical. It is a category fallacy. Or as atheist philosopher of science Michael Roos put it, he says, science does not ask certain questions, so it is to no surprise that it does not give certain answers. Science does not ask certain questions, so it is to no surprise it does not give certain answers. So, in other words, appealing to science to try and investigate something like a soul would be like trying to use a ruler to measure your weight. It's the wrong tool for the assessment. If you ask me, how much do you weigh? I'd first say, well, rude, but hand me that ruler, let's find out. Hand me that ruler, let's find out. Okay, no. God doesn't like that joke. No, he doesn't. Are we good? All right. As long as my soul's good, we're good. So it'd be like appealing to a ruler to measure your weight. So what would be the right tool for the assessment? How could we go about investigating or answering any of these questions, whether or not the soul exists? And quite frankly, the answer is logic, philosophy, reason. So the tool that we're going to use today to examine these things is known as a law of identity. If you want the big $5 word to impress someone, technically the phrase is Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals. But if you want to, we'll save our money and just call it the law of identity for right now. And according to the law of identity, we're going to use this to look at our 2 basic points. Again, the first point, consciousness is not physical. And 2, I am more than a brain and body, I am a soul. Now, let's unpack the law of identity. According to Leibniz's law, if 2 things in question are identical, in philosophy, when you say something is identical, you mean they are literally the same thing. So take some A and some B. According to Leibniz's law, if A is the same thing as B, or if A is identical to B, same word, then whatever's true of A is going to be true of B and vice versa. So here's an illustration. So if I said Eric Hernandez is the same person or identical to the guest speaker, how many people am I talking about? 1. I'm just using 2 different labels to refer to the same thing. So given Leibniz's law of identity, if Eric Hernandez is the same as the guest speaker, then whatever's true of Eric Hernandez will be true of the guest speaker and vice versa because they're the same person. They're identical. Now, in principle, this now gives us a test for identity. How so? Well, if I can in principle find something true of B that's not true of A or vice versa, well then given in Leibniz's law, they cannot be the same thing. Are you with me? Now, let's give an illustration, a thought experiment. Suppose you walk into a lab and you see 2 bottles of clear fluid. One of them is labeled water, the other is labeled chemical X. But suppose chemical X was worn out and you couldn't read what it said. Now, without doing any kind of scientific experiment, you want to ask yourself, are these 2 the same substance? Are they the same thing? Are they identical? So what you begin to do is you begin to look at the properties that these substances possess. Look at the properties these substances possess. You see that they're both fluid, they're both clear, and based on this, you assume that therefore they must be the same substance. They must be identical. But suppose you turn over chemical X, and on the back it says caution, flammable, and you think, oh, well, wait a minute. I know that water's not flammable, which means even if I don't know what chemical X is, at the very least, I can now conclude that what? They're not the same thing. Sharp group. Wow, Pastor did tell me this was a sharp crown. So, with this in mind, let's look at our 2 basic points, and let's focus first on this first point, consciousness is not physical. Now, again, taking it slow, what is consciousness? Consciousness is, again, something you define ostensibly. It means you have to point to an instance or example of it. Imagine this. How would you describe the color purple to a blind person? Someone who was born blind, you couldn't, right? In fact, even to people who aren't blind, the way you describe color is you say this, or that, or here's an example. That's called defining something in an ostensive way. So consciousness is the same way, and there are 5 states of consciousness. There are thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and acts of will, or we can call volition. Now, why 5? Because each of these are different than the other. And again, let's practice what we just learned, Leibniz's law of identity. Take something like thoughts and beliefs. How do we know that they're not the same state? Well, because imagine this. I can have thoughts I don't believe, and I can believe things that I'm not currently, and I can think things that I don't believe, and I can believe things that I'm not currently thinking. So they're not the same thing, right? So with this in mind, consider now what my professor said, because again, there are 5 states of consciousness, and to kind of help wrap your mind around this, imagine water. So water is a substance, and water can exist in 3 different states, solid, liquid, and gas, and each of these states are characterized by its respective properties. So when water is in a solid state, it has a property of being hard, liquid state, liquidity, gaseous state, vaporous, and so on and so forth. In the same way, your soul is a substance, and your soul can be in different states of consciousness, 5 different states, and each state of consciousness is characterized by its respective properties. So, let's think about what my professor said. Now, according to what my professor was saying, if the mind and brain are identical, if naturalism is true, then remember, given Leibniz's law of identity, whatever is true of the mind must be true of the brain and vice versa, given this logical law of identity. But again, in principle, if we can find just one thing, just all we need is one example, just one thing true of the brain or mind that's not true of the other and vice versa, then again, it would follow that they are not the same thing. Very good. So, let me show you too how this is relevant not just to whether or not the soul exists. If you're speaking to someone, like my professor was, who's a naturalist, on their view, only the physical world exists, nothing more, nothing less. I was talking to a young man once who was an atheist and claimed to be a naturalist. And so I asked him this. I said, well, let me ask you a question. Would you agree with me that if atheism is true, then nothing non-physical should exist? You know, like angels, demons, spirits, anything like that. He said, yeah, I agree with that. I said, okay. Now, by the same line of logic, we could then say if something non-physical does exist, then it would follow that the inverse would be true, namely that atheism is false. I said, do you agree? He said, yes. And I'm like, well, I got him. He already agreed. So we could put it this way. If atheism is true, consciousness would have to be identical or reducible to something physical like the brain. However, if it's not identical or reducible to something physical like the brain, then it would follow, again, that atheism cannot be true. So the question is consciousness physical? Now, is consciousness physical? The short answer is no, but the long answer is no with more O's at the end of that. 4 people, thank you. So let's look at this. Is the mind and brain the same thing? And no, and this is trivially easy to show and demonstrate. We could spend the whole time just talking about consciousness. But let me give you these 3 examples. So consider this. Take a state of my mind, like my thoughts or beliefs. My thoughts and beliefs can be true or false, but no region of my brain is true or false. It doesn't make sense to say that this side, this hemisphere of my brain these neurons firing are true, but these neurons over here firing are false. It's a category fallacy. It doesn't make sense to say. Similarly, think of this. My brain can be in a state that measures 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or the taste of a banana, which is in my mind, it's a sensation, is not 7 inches long. It makes no sense to ask, how many inches long is the smell of a rose or the taste of a banana? It's a category fallacy. And another one, my brain can be in a state that weighs 3 pounds, but my thoughts or beliefs don't weigh 3 pounds. In fact, you may be having heavy thoughts throughout this lecture, but you're not going to go out and buy a neck brace when we're done here, right? Didn't go over well. Let me write that down. Jeez. So, I can go through many, many more examples, but the point is simply this. If all the properties of my brain are physical, and all the properties of my mind are non-physical, in talking with this atheist, I said, it would follow then that consciousness, if it exists, cannot be physical. But now here's a problem. If consciousness exists and cannot be physical, then given what we agreed upon earlier, it would follow then if you're conscious, well then atheism can't be true. So the question is, are you conscious, and did you consciously decide to become an atheist? Because if you did, you shouldn't be an atheist. Now, what about what my professor said? In fact, we can even push this a little bit further. We know that in instances of like brain damage or Alzheimer's, affecting certain regions of your brain will affect certain functions of your mind. It is indeed true what he said, that if you were to take an antidepressant pill or some kind of narcotic, it can affect the way you think, your moods, your behavior, sensations. That is true. But does this prove that the mind and brain are the same thing? Does it prove that they're reducible to one another? Does it prove there is no soul and we are just brains and bodies? No. Why? Simply put, because cause or dependence does not establish identity. What do we mean by that? Let's put it this way. Suppose I'm the world's greatest guitar player. I'm not. I don't play guitar. My father does. I don't. I play drums. I have the gift of banging things and making them make noise. That's about all I can do. But suppose I'm the world's greatest guitar player, but one of my guitar strings pops. Now, because the guitar string pops, it would then follow that I am no longer able to play the music that I want to play or play certain notes like the note C that I want to play. So we have established with this that there is a cause and effect or a dependency relationship between a guitarist and his guitar when he wants to play music. But does it follow from this cause, effect, or dependency relationship that therefore a guitarist is reducible or identical to a guitar? No, of course not. Yet there is a correlation between them. Now, what about taking it a step further? Suppose I popped another string and I was unable to play something as simple as a note C. Would it follow from this that therefore the note C is inside the guitar, quite literally, and that if I broke it open, the note C would fall out of it? No. Right? Your worship pastor doesn't get up on stage and he's about to play and says, wait, the note C fell out. It might be in my trunk. Let me run and go get it. So in the same way that notes aren't in pianos or guitars, your thoughts aren't in your brain. There's a correlation, but they're not inside the other, though there's a cause and effect dependency relationship between them. So in other words, just because we can establish that there are certain things that are caused or dependent upon a guitar in order for a musician to play his music or to play a note, it doesn't follow from this that therefore they're the same thing. In the same way, just because you can show that damage to my brain, taking narcotics, antidepressant pills, just because you can show that there is some type of a cause and effect relationship between states of my brain and states of my mind, it doesn't follow that the mind and brain are the same thing because, as I said earlier, cause or dependence is not the same thing as identity. Are you with me? Now, and it's just funny because I hear this objection a lot. Like from non-believers, they say, yeah, well, if there's a soul, how come, when you do this to your brain, you lose this, these parts of your mind or memory? And I'm like, well, the same reason that if you detune a guitar while I'm playing it, you mess with my music. And they act like this is an epiphany that no one's ever thought of in the history of the world. Even cavemen knew that if you hit me over the head really hard, I'm going to get dizzy. All right, it's not an epiphany or some type of new technology that we've discovered that messing with the brain affects the mind. But note, by default, that already implies there are two things at play, something physical and something non-physical. So if anything, it shows some type of a duality of things, not that it's just a brain and body. So we've established consciousness is not physical. The next point is that I'm more than a brain and body, but here's a segue. The word I, what does that refer to? We can put it this way as well. We've established consciousness exists, and it's not physical. So the next question to ask is, what is the thing that possesses consciousness? What is consciousness grounded in? Well, there's at least one thing that's conscious that I know for certain, that's me. I know I am conscious. In fact, this was part of René Descartes' whole argument, because he was addressing skepticism, and he was saying, well, if knowledge requires certainty, which it doesn't, but he was saying, let me just play with this for a second. If knowledge requires certainty, then to have knowledge, I must be certain of something. What's the one thing I can be certain about? Well, the fact that I exist. Well, how do I know I exist? Well, if I'm thinking, I must exist, and hence I think, therefore I am. And I've had people say, well, you can't know if you exist. What if someone doubts their existence? And I say, well, who's doubting? They say, me. I'm like, oh, well, you exist. You can't doubt your existence unless you exist. So, what is the I? Now, the word I is what's called an indexical word, meaning it's a word that refers to something else. So the word here or there or that is an indexical word that it's a reference point. So the word I is a reference word that is used to refer to me, the self. But again, the question is, what am I? Here's where we're going to now transition into talking more specifically of something known as substance dualism. This is a view that I hold to, the view of the soul and philosophy of mind known as substance dualism. Dualism literally means just twoism. So it's essentially the notion that there is something physical and something immaterial to me, the self. So we can define it this way. According to substance dualism, the word I is essentially the view that I am a soul that has a brain and body. So the word I is the soul, and I as a soul have a brain and body. So we can put it this way. I am literally identical to my soul. I literally am the soul. I am the same thing as my soul. In other words, I have a body. Technically speaking, I have a body, but I don't, quote, have a soul. Does that make sense? I am a soul. I don't have a soul. I have a body, but I am a soul. And quite frankly, a body without a soul is nothing more than a corpse. Because again, I am a soul, but I have a body. But if I can actually be honest with you, because we're in a church and I want to be transparent, a few years ago I did change my position on this just a little bit, because I have now come to see that we do have souls. Because a few years ago I was looking for a car and I actually bought a Kia Soul, and it's orange out in the parking lot. I paid real money for that just to make this joke, so I'd like a better laugh. It's sitting right in the park. It's a very rich punchline, if you will. When I was looking for it, I was soul searching. I'm trying to milk it. I bought it just for this joke. So I do have a soul. So let's put it this way. So if I am a soul, if the word I is identical to a soul, then it would follow that by default I am immaterial. Now, if I am immaterial and yet my brain and body are something physical, well, then automatically we can already see that it would follow from this, given Leibniz's law of identity, that I am not identical to a brain and body. Why? Because I'm immaterial, my brain and body are physical. So let's look at the second point, again, using Leibniz's law of identity. So let's, for the sake of argument, assume that physicalism is true. What's physicalism? Again, the view that I am identical or reducible to nothing more than a brain and body. Now, if human beings were just purely physical objects, if physicalism is true, another big word, then human beings would be what we would call in philosophy a mereological aggregate. We're just going to call it aggregate for short. What is an aggregate? An aggregate is a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. An aggregate is a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. So things like watches, cars, or Lego bricks are what we would call aggregates. They are a collection of separable things in a certain structure. Now, the key thing to know about aggregates, because we're going to contrast this with a substance. Remember, this is substance dualism. I am a soul, an immaterial substance. Aggregates are not substances. They're a collection of parts. And the thing to note about aggregates is that their existence and identity necessarily depend on the parts and their structure for their existence. Their existence and identity depends on the parts and structure. Here's an example. Suppose you took a tricycle. By definition, a tricycle has 3 wheels. Now, if you were to remove just one of the wheels from this tricycle, then we could say in a technical metaphysical sense, a tricycle has ceased to exist and a bicycle has come into existence. Why? Because, again, technically speaking, for aggregates, their existence and identity depend on their parts. You change their parts, you change their identity and what they are. You with me? So, here's another thought experiment. Anyone see the Marvel Disney series WandaVision? Has anyone seen that? Trick question, not a Christian show. Shame on you. No, I'm just joking. So, at the end of that show, well, if anyone's not seen it, I guess it's your fault. It's like way too late. Now, here's a spoiler. At the end of the show, there's 2 visions, right? And they kind of argue of which one is the original or which one is the true vision. And they start talking about something known as the ship of Theseus. This is actually a thought experiment that comes from the philosophy of mind. So what's interesting is, I'm able to see the field that I dive into, seen here in Marvel. So let's put it this way. Suppose you have this car. And again, I have the Kia Soul, not that one. This isn't the car I have. But take this car, and let me ask you this. Let's say we replace the tires on this car. Is it the same car? But is not the tire part of the car? So let's try this now. And good to see you, Jose. Friend from high school. So let's suppose this. Suppose we change every single nut and bolt of the car. Suppose we change everything on the car. The windshield, the bumper, the tires, everything. We give it a nice little shine. Is it the same car? before you answer that question, let's say we now have all the replaced parts. Let's take the replaced parts that we just took off, and let's put those back together. You now have two cars. Now, which of these two cars, if any, is the original? Now, regardless of your answer, there's at least one thing we can agree on. They both cannot be the original. And what I think this goes to demonstrate is, simply speaking, that, as I said earlier, when it comes to aggregates, they don't maintain what's called identity through change. I would argue if you change just one of the parts, it is no longer the same object. You now have a different object. You can rewind that if they record it, and you can look at that again. But when you begin to replace the parts of aggregates, they depend on their parts and their structure. You replace those, you have a different aggregate. So I'm going to give you three arguments for the second point, which is I am more than a brain and body, I am a soul. Here's the first argument, It's known as the argument from identity through change. Argument from identity through change. And it goes as follows. Premise one, I am either a purely physical object, an aggregate, or an immaterial soul. If I am a purely physical object, then I do not retain identity through change. Now, depending on which of these two concludes, which of these two I am, it would depend on whether or not I maintain identity through change. So which is it? Well, it's going to depend on that last part. Do I maintain identity through change? Here's a thought experiment. Suppose I committed a crime 7 to 10 years ago, right? So 7 to 10 years ago, I commit a crime. And we now know through science has shown us that virtually every 7 to 10 years, you replace almost every single cell in your body. So every 7 to 10 years, you get virtually a new body. Now, suppose 7 to 10 years ago I commit a crime, but they just now find the evidence. So I get a knock on my door from a detective, and he knocks on my door and says, hey, Eric, we just discovered some evidence that you committed this crime 7 to 10 years ago. And I say, Jay, look, come on. We both know that human beings are just identical and reducible to purely physical objects. So technically speaking, the person that you're looking for existed 7 to 10 years ago. I am a different set of properties and parts. So go find that person, but good luck because he doesn't exist. And of course, he's going to look at me and say, no, I'm sorry, Eric, I'm going to have to take you in. Now, what I think this shows us is that it is intuitively commonsensical that I do maintain identity through change. But if that's the case, then it follows that what? I am not a purely physical object, therefore, I'm a soul. A similar argument given by an atheist philosopher, Jaegwon Kim, he put it this way. He says, in 2001, this brain and body did not exist, but I did exist in 2001, therefore it follows that I must not be identical or reducible to a brain and body. So, second argument, indivisibility of personhood. Again, we're going to start with the same premise one. I am either a purely physical object or an immaterial soul. Premise two, purely physical objects can be divided and exist in various percentages or degrees. So with this one, once again, let's unpack this. Degreed properties are things like being loud, hard, or soft. So for example, these are things that can be divided and exist in various percentages or degrees. So something that is soft can be softer, something that is hard can be harder, or something that is loud can be louder, and so on and so forth. So a degreed property is a property that can fluctuate. It can change. It can exist divided or in percentages. Now contrast this with a non-degreed property. And a non-degreed property is something that cannot be divided and cannot exist in various percentages or degrees. We can simplify it this way. It is an all or nothing kind of thing. It either is or it isn't. There is no in between. So consider this property. Take the property of being even or evenness. The number 2 and the number 6 both possess the property of being even, but it would make no sense to say that the number 6 is more even than the number 2. Why? Because evenness is not a degreed property. It either is even or it isn't even. There's no in between. So you can't say that bigger numbers are more even than smaller numbers because it's not a degreed property. Are you with me? So, given that these are all or nothing kind of things, let's now apply this notion to physical objects. Because you are a person. As a human being, you possess the property of personhood. And the question now becomes, is being a person a degreed property or a non-degreed property? Well, let's first look at physical objects. Suppose I took this table and I cut it in half and I burned one half. It would now make sense to say that I have 50% of a table, right? I have 50% of a table. But God forbid, suppose I get in a car accident and my arms and legs are severed. Now, note, it would make sense to say I have 50% of a body, but it wouldn't make sense to say I'm now 50% of a person. I am still a 100% person with only 50% of a body. Now, note the implications of this, which we don't have time to go in too deeply. So, look at something like abortion. Something either is a human person or it's not. There is no, it's becoming a human person. It either is or it isn't. There is no gradient. It's like being even. So whether you're this big or this big, you're a person given the certain conditions that you have, and your level of development or your size or your environment or your degree of dependency is irrelevant as to whether or not you're a person. You either are or you are not, and from the moment of conception, we know you're a new living person. Because personhood is not a degree of property. Consider this. Men are typically larger than women. But women, would you say that it follows that therefore men are more valuable or more persons than women? No, of course not, right? In other words, we can put it this way. Does having more mass and matter mean that you matter more? No. So if we ground any type of intrinsic value to be in a person, well, if physicalism is true, then we now have a degreed property of personhood and value dependent on how much mass and matter you have. But clearly that's absurd. So if you are not dependent on your degree of mass or matter, then it follows you cannot be identical nor reducible to something physical. You must be something transcendent to the physical, namely the soul. Now, some people say, well, it's not the body, it's actually the brain that what grounds your personhood. Well, same problem. So these are scans of conditions known as anencephalic disease or Dandy-Walker syndrome. And it's a rare condition where someone could either be born with 30% of a brain, 40% of a brain, or for a certain condition, a surgery could be performed where they remove 20 or 30% of a brain. But note that if you remove 30% of my brain, does it follow that I'm only 70% of a person? Well, no, because again, being a person is not a degree of property. Now, some may argue, yeah, but you wouldn't be able to function. Right. Same principle. I may lose functioning, but I don't lose personhood because being a person is not a degreed property. So, if I cannot be divided or exist in percentages or degrees, I'm an all or nothing kind of thing. Therefore, I'm not a purely physical object. Therefore, I am a soul. One last argument, and I know we're starting late, so I don't know where we're at on time. One last argument. Argument from free will. Now, let's start. Definition. Free will, what is it? Essentially, free will is being the originator or the origin or source, first mover, if you will, of your will or actions. In other words, you are not caused to act by something prior or external to yourself. So, for example, if I lift my hand to vote and I was the thing that caused my arm to move, I was the first mover of the action. However, if you shock me with a taser and that causes my arm to go up, well, then I am now caused by something external and prior to myself, and I was not the first mover, hence I didn't have free will. Now imagine this. And by the way, we're about to look at a murder scene here. In philosophy, the best way to make a point is to think of like the most gruesome examples, so you have to be careful when and where. I was on the phone with a friend once, and we were talking philosophy of morality, and I'm outside just kind of walking and playing with my kids on the phone. I'm like, yeah, so if someone were to grab a baby and torture them for fun, and I'm like, okay, wait, I'm doing philosophy outside. I better go inside and have this conversation. So suppose someone is murdered with a bullet. Now, technically speaking, it was actually the bullet that literally caused the death of the person. But here's a question. Do we blame the bullet? No. Even though it was literally the thing that killed the person. It's the thing that penetrated the heart. Why? Because the bullet did not act on its own. It was caused to act by something external and prior to itself. So let's go back one step in the chain of events, and let's look at the gun. Do we blame the gun? Depends who you vote for. No. We don't blame the gun because we know the gun was not caused to fire by itself. It too was people leave. I'm sorry. It was caused to move or act by something external and prior to herself. So if we don't blame the gun, then what do? Let's go one more step back, and here is where we can now make a distinction. Because see, the gun and bullet were secondary causes, is what we call in philosophy, whereas the person was the first cause, and as the first cause in this chain of events is a thing that caused a gun to fire, that caused a bullet to shoot, that penetrated the heart and killed the person. So whenever we want to find moral praise or blame, you always have to go back to the first cause. Now, with this in mind, let's look at the argument from free will. I am either a purely physical object, an aggregate, or an immaterial soul. Premise 2, if I am a purely physical object, then I do not possess free will. However, going back to this, again, guns and bullets don't possess free will. So let's do another thought experiment. Look at how Aristotle put this, because the question is, do I possess free will? Aristotle said this: if I move a rock with my staff, then I know that it's the staff that moved the rock, my hand moved the staff, but then he asks, what moved me? So let's imagine, for the sake of argument, that there are no souls, there is no God, and atheism is true. If atheism is true, then you would have something known as the law of causal closure. Now, what does this mean? The law of causal closure is essentially the notion that every physical event must have a physical cause. So in other words, no God or no souls can be involved in explanations. If atheism is true, the universe is a closed system, and there is no external interference from anything non-physical, every physical event must have a prior physical cause. So, going back to Aristotle's example, he asked the question, what moved me? Now remember, if you want to preserve free will, you have to be the first mover of this chain of events for something as simple as moving a rock. So let's suppose the atheist, naturalist, physicalist says, well, a neuron firing in my brain is what caused a neuron firing in my brain caused a staff to move, my hand that caused a rock to move, and guess what? In this example, I am the first cause, I have free will, and I don't need a soul to do this. I'm the first cause without a soul. But time out, flag on the field. Here's the problem with that explanation. What is that? It's a neuron firing. What is a neuron firing? It's a what kind of event? It's a physical event. And based on the law of causal closure, if there is no God, this is true. And according to this view, every physical event must have a physical cause, which means even if you want to posit, because I have no argument that, yes, a neuron fire does cause a hand to move, but again, given atheism, it must have a prior physical cause. So at this point, the non-believer is only left with two options. Here's the first option. If you want to have free will, let's look at the options. First option is this. What you can say here is, okay, well, another neuron firing caused the first neuron to fire. And there you go. I still have free will. I'm still the first cause. But wait a minute. No. Because now you have to explain that by something else. And he says, okay, well, another neuron firing caused that neuron to fire. And if that doesn't work, then you'd use another one. And of course, no, wait a minute, you're not the first cause. And then you can continue to posit neurons, but here's what begins to happen. No matter how many neurons you posit, you begin to see this infinite regress of chain of events, and, oh. No, I'm just kidding, I put that slide in there. Yeah, that was me. So, you get this infinite regress of causes, and the action can never be performed. In other words, put it this way, if you want something as simple as a staff to move a rock and then the hand to move the staff, even if you're going to posit a neuron firing, you still need to explain that by something physical, and what we just learned is you cannot keep going into an infinite regress, otherwise the action would never occur, the rock would never move, which means the first option is not possible. Let's look at the second option. No matter how many neurons you want to posit to explain this, at some point, to avoid this infinite regress, you have to now step back to something prior and external to yourself, but then what happens? Well, with respect to free will, whatever this thing was that explains that neuron is actually what moved the rock, but then now you're no longer the first cause, and if you're not the first cause, you cannot have free will. So on either option, free will is not possible. So going back to the argument, again, either purely physical or immaterial. If I'm purely physical, I don't have free will. In other words, if there is no soul, there can be no free will. However, if you do have free will, then you're a first mover, and then therefore the soul must exist. Hence, I am not a purely physical object. How many people here came for free? Anybody here came freely? Right? So people here have free will. So that means you were not cause, you do have free will, therefore you're not a purely physical object, therefore I am a soul. Now, at this point, let's deal with just one objection to this. Some atheists will say, well, wait a minute, I disagree with your third premise. I don't believe that I possess free will. In fact, I'm an atheist. And they put it this way. I had an atheist once say, well, look, I'm a free thinker. And what that means is I'm not shackled by by religious motivations or religious beliefs. I'm not brainwashed and shackled by your religion. I am free to think for myself because some people are stupid, some people are religious, and you can't tell the difference. I'm a free thinker, though. I am free to think for myself. And on top of that, we can call this rational responsibility. They are trying to own a sense of rational responsibility for their beliefs. On top of this, let's look at something like morality. Well, they'll say, I don't need God to be good. In fact, if you're only good because you're afraid of going to hell or because God tells you, the Bible tells you, you're not even being good for the right reasons, so I'm more moral than you. So I don't need God to be good because you don't need religion or you don't need God, you just need a conscience. And in fact, they'll say, imagine a world with no religion. Imagine if there were no Twin Tower events that happened. Imagine if there was no persecution like we're seeing. So it's religion that's the cause of all this immoral actions and nonsense and suppression. Because, see, science will fly you to the moon, but religion will fly you to buildings. And on top of that, well, religion is far from love. We'll call this moral responsibility. But note what they're assuming by these two things. First, let's look at free will. Remember, if you're not the first cause, these secondary causes we learn, these were not responsible for the murder. Only the first cause is responsible. But if there is no God and naturalism is true and we're just physical objects, well, then you cannot be the first cause. But here's the problem with that. You are now no longer able to praise or blame the person that pulls the trigger. Why? Because if you don't blame the gun or bullet for the murder because they're purely physical objects, and if physicalism is true and this person is just a physical object, then much like the gun or bullet, you can't blame the person either. So how can there be any praise or blame? So whatever this first cause is, you now become a secondary cause and no longer responsible for any of this. So we'll look at it this way. If the person wants to affirm moral responsibility and rational responsibility, because I was at a Christmas party once, and I was talking to this guy, never met him before. He said, I used to be a Christian, but as I began to study things for myself, as I began to look at the evidence, I became an atheist. I said, why? He says, because of the evidence and what the scientific literature says, yada, yada. I said, okay, so you study this stuff, and he was having this sense of rational responsibility. And then I said, okay, and is that what did it? He goes, no, actually, I also began to look at religion, and I found out we don't have free will. People just believe in whatever God they do because of the way they were raised, et cetera, and so forth. So you're not even free to believe what you want to believe. Okay, so it was moral issues and the notion that there is no free will led you away from God. Christianity, he said, yes. I said, okay. I said, I just have a couple questions for you. You're saying that religion is a cause of war and all this stuff, but you also said there's no free will. If there is no free will or no soul, then why would you blame the terrorists who committed the attacks on 9/11 if they had no free will to do otherwise? And how can you blame anyone for anything they do when it's not religion the cause of war, but just neurons firing in the brain? He looked kind of stunned. Never thought about that. I said, in fact, you told me also that one of the things that pushed you away from Christianity was a realization there was no free will. He said, yeah. I said, okay, just one question to that. I said, did you freely come to believe that? That there is no free will? I said, because it sounds like you're saying that based on the evidence, you logically came to the conclusion on your own free accord and free will that there was no God, but if there's free will, then how can you have that if there is no God and naturalism is true? But if there is free will and you freely decided to become an atheist, well, it sounds like God must exist because you are now a soul, an immaterial that can only be explained by a bigger immaterial soul that created us. So, which is it? Are people morally responsible for their actions? Yes, God exists. If they're not, what are you complaining about? And if you freely became an atheist because of the evidence, you have free will. If not, then you cannot claim to be more rational than the other person. Ironically, if an atheist calls themselves a free thinker and they're naturalist, well, then by their own standard, the last thing they can call themselves is a free thinker because there is no free will in their worldview. So, sum it up this way. If you want moral responsibility and rational responsibility, it requires a soul. But if there is no soul, there can be no free will. And if there is no free will, well, you cannot have rational responsibility or moral responsibility. So we can put the argument this way. If the person affirms they are rationally responsible and morally responsible, well, then guess what? They do possess free will. And if they do possess free will, then they're not purely physical objects. And if they're not purely physical objects, therefore, a soul must exist. So, just to recap, we talked about the importance of the soul, It's to love God with your mind. We talked about if there is no soul, there's no resurrection, and so forth. We ended with defining this. We looked at 2 basic points. With these 2 basic points, we had arguments for each. And let me just skip to identity through change, indivisibility of personhood, and free will. We looked at that, moral responsibility, rational responsibility. If there is free will, then you have rational responsibility and moral responsibility. But if you have that, then a soul must exist. And if that's the case, Christianity is true. There's evidence for a resurrection, and we can have hope and trust and a confidence. And as Paul said, these momentary afflictions compare nothing to the eternal weight of glory that we'll one day experience. Amen.